Hi, welcome to Here to There, hosted by Carolyn Taketa, former attorney, current small groups pastor, and life coach. Through monthly conversations with pastors, authors, and guests, we hope to stir your thoughts and encourage you to move from where you are to where you want to be, in your personal life, in your leadership, or in your ministry.
Welcome to Group Talk. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Carolyn Taketa, your host and the small groups pastor at Calvary Community Church in Westlake Village, California. Well, a couple of months ago, we took a survey on our Small Group Network Facebook page, and we asked, what topics do you want us to address in 2018? And one of the top vote getters was a topic of coaching, which we weren't surprised by at all, because if you ask any small group ministry point leader for an area of ministry that's consistently challenging and is often a source of confusion and honestly frustration as well, it is in this area of coaching small group leaders. And I know so many leaders who've tried various models. I've done this, I tweaked it, and some have just even thrown up their hands and given up. But we would all agree that small group leaders really need the support and the care that a coaching system can provide. And the shepherding, of course, but it continues to be a really tough thing to work out well. So I've invited on the program Alan White, who is like the coach of the coaches, to help us think through this topic and help us avoid some coaching mistakes that are common, and help us develop a more effective and sustainable coaching model and system for our various church contexts. So Alan, thank you so much for being on the program.
Hey, thank you, Carolyn, for having me back.
I know you're one of my favorites to have back because you just articulate all these things. You have all this experience from talking to people all over the country, and then you come back and you report on, we're all kind of in the same boat.
Yeah, no, I don't feel any pressure at all.
That was the goal. Well, let me give you a little background about Alan so you don't feel even more pressure. Alan White coaches churches in launching Exponential Groups. And in over 25 years of ministry, he served on staff at two churches, New Life Christian Center in Turlock, California, and then Brookwood Church in Simpsonville, South Carolina, as well as coaching over 1,500. Okay, no pressure there, but 1,500, that's a lot.
I've already done that.
Across North America. And he's also the author of Exponential Groups, which is excellent, Unleashing Your Church's Potential, and he and his family live in Greenville. And one of my favorite things at conferences, if Alan and I are in the same place, I love hanging out with him because he has a terrific sense of humor, mostly directed at yourself, but also just around. You always make me laugh. And so hopefully this will be a fun conversation, even though it's a topic that's pretty weighty.
Yeah, because if I make fun of other people like you, Carolyn, they tend to beat me up. So I make fun of myself.
So that's probably a good way to go for all of us. All right. So on coaching, let's just dive in. And perhaps we can start off with a definition of coaching so we're all on the same page. What is coaching, and what are other names maybe we call this in our context?
You know, I think the best definition I've ever heard came from my friend Carl George, who said that the role of the coach is to refocus the player. And so that idea that the leader gets bogged down in the day-to-day of leading a group, which is everything from making sure your house is clean and the babysitter's on time and following up with new members and all of that. And sometimes, it's easy to lose sight of why we're doing this, or, we tell them it's easy it's easy. Just invite your friends, just open up your home. Groups are so easy to do. And then somebody shows up that has like some major life crisis. They're like, this is a little more than what you described for me. Well, sometimes it takes that coach to help, to guide them through, to train them on how to handle that situation, maybe sometimes even to refer an individual to somewhere outside of the group. So I think that the coach is there for support, for training, for accountability, for a lot of different reasons.
And you find that coaches predominantly are lay leaders or staff?
Well, it depends on how much money you have. And the churches that I was in, and probably most churches across the country, we don't have a lot of money. So what we find are either mature folks or people that have experience leading groups that'll take a couple under their wing, a couple of other leaders under their wing, and figure out a way to coach them the best we can. There are a few systems where they hire people to coach. I just don't think that's very transferable because most people don't have that kind of a budget.
Right. That's true. And I do think having lay leaders in some regard is helpful because it gives them a chance for certain small group leaders with those gifting to expand and grow in those areas and get discipled on a different level. So it does open that up in a way that maybe if you're in a church that there's not a lot of opportunities for that level of spiritual mentorship would be a great way to serve.
Yeah, definitely. And what I like about it is it gives people with, some of the big L leadership gifts, it gives them an opportunity to serve in a way that fits their capacity to lead.
Yes.
And even looking at the church I served at last, Brookwood here in Greenville, South Carolina, looking around the table at our monthly meeting of our leadership team. So these were leaders of leaders of leaders. So they had coaches had leaders, leaders had groups. But, kind of doing the math in my head, not only did I realize I could never hire people of this caliber to work on my staff, but on any given meeting with that group, I probably had well over $1.5 million in annual salaries represented in that room.
Wow.
So definitely, people that had great leadership capacity, that were doing that in the marketplace, and then they could lend their gifts to the church to invest in small group ministry.
Yes. So that all sounds good. And we can agree that it's really necessary. But why is coaching, Alan, such a challenging area for small groups ministry? And what are some issues that just come up that makes it so difficult?
Well, first of all, it's hard work. It is hard work finding the right people, investing in those people, and beginning to, this was equally hard for me, was learning to lead the ministry in a different way. Whereas
explain that.
Everything didn't depend on me anymore. And so I had to begin to hand off not just responsibilities, but also authority to people that were volunteer, people that I trusted, people that I invested in. And it's like I began to focus on a smaller group of people. Imagine that in small groups ministry. But I focused on a smaller group. I focused on a team. And I didn't put my energy toward leaders or connecting people into groups or anything like that anymore. And I personally have not recruited a small group leader since 2004. But it was a matter of finding these people, investing in them, meeting with them, sharing the ministry with them. And it's probably been among my best experience in ministry is having that team of people that were leading the small group together with me and regarding them more so as equals than underlings that I was going to delegate assignments to, and then they had to go meet their assignments and come back. That they weren't just my worker bees; they were my partners, and that was a tremendous thing. But it took a lot of me having to give up some control. Yeah. And my name is Alan. I'm a recovering control freak. So
I think that's probably the piece that's hard. And some of the control freak piece I totally get, but it's also because we want to make sure that our leaders are shepherded well. And so I think people have different styles of leadership. And so if you recruit a coach whose style of leadership is a little different than yours, it makes it tougher to kind of release that and value that and see God use that. So that's a really good word for us, control freaks. I would join myself in that. I read an article on your blog recently about a national survey you did of small group pastors that's related to coaching. And it was so interesting because the stats that you reported, they pretty much resonated with me. I could totally relate to it. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what you found, because I'm pretty sure our listeners could probably relate as well.
Yeah, I don't have a survey right in front of me, but I know a lot of people struggled with what do they do? Or some of the other answers that ranked really high were identifying and recruiting the right people. How do you do that? Who do you look for? What do you look for? There was some concern about communication between coaches and small group leaders. And and I've been in situations where I had a really nice looking org chart and it all looked good on paper, but there wasn't really much happening. Yeah. And so how do you make sure that that's taking place? How do people know what to do? All of those sorts of things that came out of the survey from, churches of various sizes, from across North America, but they were all kind of resonated with some of the same things as far as what's the role, who's the right person for the role, how do I recruit them, all of those kinds of things. Which is similar to what we do, kind of the level down would be with the small group leaders itself. It's all quite similar. One of the things that wasn't in your survey that I have found to be challenging is the chemistry between the coach and the leaders. Like, that's really important. That's the intangible that I didn't understand as I was getting into coaching, that, to some extent, it's a little bit of a matchmaker, unless they planted those people themselves, which works fabulously better. But if they hadn't, and I was bringing in a coach midstream,
or even with new leaders, which is a better model, always doing with newer leaders. But I couldn't account for, would these people click? And if they don't click, then it's so much harder. Because then they're discouraged because people don't want to meet with them and vice versa. But when there's a natural affinity or click or chemistry or that intangible thing that wants them to be together, where God just kind of makes that happen, then it just doesn't even like work. There's so much joy for both the leader and the coach, and then makes your work, our job, so much easier. But how do you account for that chemistry thing?
Well, some of it, like what you're saying, is if a group started from members of a group, going out and starting their own group, then the natural coach there would be the leader of the group that they came out of. Right. Because more than anything, coaching is built on a relationship. Mm-hmm. It's not a task. It's not an authority thing. It's not a hierarchy. It's got to have that relationship. And so the other thing is if they already know each other. Maybe they weren't in a group together, but they just know each other from church or from being around town and running in some of the same circles. So, I more so than even geography, I would go with where are those relationships currently lie. Now, I did make one mistake, and I repented of this many, many times. Well, the mistake as far as connecting coaches with leaders they had a relationship with is I allowed a man to coach his son-in-law.
Oh,
and that was a big mistake.
You must have been young back then.
I apologize profusely for that one, and I unlinked it as soon as I could. But, it's bad enough getting advice from your father-in-law. Now you're going to be coached by your father-in-law. And I'm really surprised that he didn't just, quit and delete my phone number. But
so did you try the mother-in-law and the daughter as well?
I didn't do that. I learned my lesson the hard way. But, the other thing, too, that I've done over the years is try to set something up as a trial run. Mm. So instead of saying that, the person that is highly task-oriented, highly detailed, is going to be the coach of this very amiable, friendly, outgoing person who they're never going to get a report from. Let's face it, it's not going to happen. But the coach is so desperate to get a report right. Well, I would give it a trial run and say, okay, we're coming up on this new series. I'm going to partner you guys together. It's only for 6 weeks. Let's see how it goes.
That's good.
And if they benefited from it, then we can continue it on. If for some reason, it just didn't work, rub somebody the wrong way, then we could say, well, let's go back and think this through again.
Oh, that's great.
But at least it was only 6 weeks. And it's like, okay, it's the end of the commitment, and now we're going to go a different direction with this. Whereas, if you say this is going to be the coach for you the rest of your life, if it really is a bad fit, you may lose the leader, the coach, or both of them to some other church.
Yes. So it's good to do a trial dating before you actually end up
Absolutely
engaged. It's a great idea. All right, well, let's get to the top 5 coaching mistakes you've seen with small group point people. You want to run us down through those? And are these in any particular order, or are these like just? No,
there's no particular order.
Okay.
And this isn't. People may have another 5. I had 10, but you limited me to 5. So we have. So if your 5 are in the other 5, that's Carolyn's fault.
Oh, nice. But you can go on Helen's blog and read them all.
All right. So we can start at the top if you want to, Carolyn.
Sure.
However you want to go.
All right, number 1, no coaches. Okay, these are my peers, and I've been here at seasons 2 where I just want to give up because it's so much work. It's so hard.
It is a lot of work, but here's what happened to us. The first time we did small groups was back in 1994 at our church at New Life out in California. And we weren't very big at the time. I think we were maybe 250 on the weekend. And so we recruited 10 top-notch people from our congregation to lead groups. They all started in January of 94. They all quit in December of 94.
Okay, you got a year out of it.
Yeah, a year. But my continuity was 0% is exactly how that was. And, and I'm not afraid of these stories because it's real life. And some people are heartened by the fact that all my groups quit. But anyway, we went back and asked them, very important questions. Do you love Jesus? Do you want to go to heaven? Why did you quit leading your group?
Because there's no correlation between those.
Not at all. No guilt there. But what they came back to us and said was, was, well, we kind of felt like a lone ranger leading our group. Now, this seemed a little ridiculous because the pastor and I were available to them. I mean, we're a church of 250 people. In fact, we talked to them all the time.
Oh, that's interesting.
But we weren't having intentional conversations about what was going on in their small groups and how they were doing as leading and where they needed to be encouraged and where they needed to have some training. And so what we discovered was that if without any kind of coaching, people tended to, they would kind of burn out or they would lose focus or it would just become too much. But here's the thing. Here's kind of the silver lining, if that's been the experience of anybody who's listening to this, is that if you have group leaders that have not been coached very well or have not been coached at all, but they've figured it out good enough how to keep their group going, you have a great pool of potential coaches that you could invite to help new leaders.
By experience,
So there is a good piece in that is if you're coaching for whatever reason has failed, you do have a benefit in that these people have figured it out and they have something that they could offer a new leader if it doesn't know as much as they do.
Right. So we know that we do need some intentionality about having people shepherd it. Number 2 is unclear expectation of coaches, and I've been guilty of this too.
Yeah, so we get this idea because people listen to podcasts and they go, well, that Alan White guy said we should have coaches, or Carl George said we should have coaches, or Steve Gladen said we should have coaches. And so we recruit these people to coach, but we're not really sure about what they should do. So I had this coach a number of years ago. We'll call her Carol because that was her name. And
that's no protecting any people.
So I had Carol, I had Dan, that was the other coach. And so I thought we're going to start this off right because last time we had no coaches. This time I have 2, then we're going to build with that. And we would do the huddles where we'd get all the leaders together. And the coaches were in the room and they were available and they were there to greet their leaders. And guess who did all the training and who led all the meetings? Alan White. That was the problem right there. And so I'd send them out. They would visit groups and they would fill out a little report and bring it back to me. So Carol comes by my office one day and she says, I feel like I'm your spy. And she said it like mysterious like that. I said, why do you feel like you're my spy, Carol? She said, well, I'm going to these groups and I'm gathering this information and filling out these reports and turning them into you. She says, I feel like I'm your spy. I said, well, it's because you are my spy. And so then, as we continued on and we're doing these monthly huddles and I'm leading the huddles and doing all the training and they're kind of around visiting groups and being my spies, Carol comes back to me another time and she says, I enjoy working with the leaders, but I'm kind of bored. And I thought, how is she bored? Because I'm busy. How could she possibly be bored? And all of a sudden it dawned on me the reason that Carol is bored is because I'm still doing everything, even though I have people and coaches. But, the truth was every time she came to my office, she complained. So I just fired her. That's not true. It's not true.
It's hard to fire a late leader, but okay.
It's very hard. No, I'm kidding. I didn't fire her. I changed it. And so I made it so that, the coaches ran these meetings and I didn't even show up. And, I just snuck off to my office during that meeting and did whatever pastors do in their office when they sneak off. But in this, one thing I actually learned this from one of my coaches, is when it comes to expectations, you have to have 3 things. They have to be clear, they have to be reasonable, and they have to be accountable. So let's say, what would be a clear expectation of a coach? So you would say, I want you to call your leaders once a week, call your new leaders once a week, because they need that kind of encouragement. Right. So that's clear, but how many are they going to call? 50, 100? No, that's not reasonable. So maybe if they're leading, the coach is leading a group of their own, then maybe they're calling 1 to 2, maybe 3 new leaders a week. So they're calling 3 new leaders once a week. So it's clear and it's reasonable, and then it's accountable. Because either me or a person on my leadership team is going to give them a call and they're going to say, so tell me what you're learning from the leaders that you're talking to. And the coach would maybe say, oh, I haven't had a chance to talk to them this week. You say, that's okay. Why don't you take the next couple of days, make your calls, and I'll call you back on Friday and hear what and the assumption is that they're doing it, not, we don't want it to be heavy handed.
Right.
but so clear, reasonable, and accountable.
Well, those are good.
And to keep it fairly simple, I think it's okay to learn together. The group that I worked with, that I really loved working with out in California, I brought him in and I said, here's the deal, guys. I said, I don't have those figured out. But if you will take this journey with me to figure out leading this small group ministry and supporting these leaders, then I would be glad to have you. But no, please understand that, super pastor doesn't have all the answers. And I had to be vulnerable with him and admit that. But the truth is, it made our relationships better as a team.
Right. I can see that. A side note, so while we're on the topic of what's reasonable, what would you recommend as a span of care for a typical lay coach? Are you talking 3? Should they be responsible for 3 or 5 or 10? What have you seen to work?
I actually go with a different kind of metric, in that you think when a coach calls a leader, they're going to ask about that leader's primary relationships. Mm-hmm. So here's my measure. They can coach as many as they want, as long as by memory they know the leader's spouse's name and the name of the leader's children. Okay. Because those are the leader's
How about the leader's dog?
Well, I don't know about dogs, but if it depends on, it depends on how important that is. And I've had people that have led, they've coached 3 groups and they were brilliant, and I gave them a 4th and they were a disaster. Huh. But then I had one guy that coached 25 groups, and he was single at the time. He was there before and after all 3 services on Sunday morning and connected with them. And, he just had the capacity to do that. Not everybody does. So I think it really has to be, and I know Steve Gladen talks about knowing important dates in people's lives and those sorts of things. But, not on an index card, not in a database, not in your contacts on your phone, but from memory. Because you're not always going to have those things. And if you see somebody in the store and you're asking about their wife, how is Mrs. What's her name? That doesn't work. Oh, that's really personal and warming. That does well for our relationship.
That's a good word. So there's not necessarily a mechanical number. And I like your point about the person who could handle 25 versus the person who could handle 3. I think people have different capacities, different seasons of life. If they have young children, they're not going to have as much time, depending on their workload, depending on commute. I mean, there's so many factors. And
I have 4 kids between 4 and 16, and sometimes I call them the wrong name. So I don't.
So your capacity, you're saying, is 1. You can handle 1 leader. Alan.
It's like Sam, Timothy, Jesse. Oh, Julia. You're Julia. I forgot.
And your wife's name would be,
Tiffany. Okay, I can lead one. I can lead one. I can lead myself barely.
All right. And then number 3, he says lack of accountability. And this ties in a little bit what you were saying earlier, clear, reasonable, and accountable. So lack of accountability is towards with you as the point leader, right?
Yeah. And the thing is, we hate doing this.
I know, because you feel like the bad guy. You don't want to feel like the cop.
That's the thing. But here's the deal. If we say it's important and we never check up on people, then it's not important.
That's true.
And with us, we get distracted. Oh, I got to write the lesson for this week. Oh, I got to do a study. I got to visit somebody. I got to, check my Facebook 12 times, and I've only done it 10 times today. We get into all of this stuff, and why don't we pick up the phone and we'll send them an email. Well, that's personal. We got to pick up the phone.
I think it's because we're afraid it's going to be a hard conversation.
Maybe. But the reality is, and this isn't original with me, we have to inspect what we expect.
Yes.
Otherwise, it's not going to happen. But on the other hand, we can't make it legalistic, because sometimes we get into accountability, and accountability sounds like accounting. But then 1 Corinthians 13 tells us that love keeps no record of wrongs. So, we have to soften that a little bit. There was one church I was working with in Pennsylvania that their coaching became so rigid and so legalistic, they had to actually fire all their coaches and not do it for at least a year, because it just got really intense and creepy. And nobody wants that.
So you don't want to feel like Big Brother taking a 5-page report.
Yeah. But then if you don't ask, then you don't know.
Yes.
And you can't assume that things are happening, because then you'll go, oh, well, I coach these 5 groups, but I haven't talked to them in, a year and a half. And then you start calling them and you go, well, apparently I'm coaching, 2 groups and one of them is barely making it. So, some of that you just have to, because if you don't contact them, here's what happens. As the small group pastor or director, you get frustrated because you're counting on these coaches to make this investment in the lives of these leaders. The coaches are starting to feel guilty because they're not making the calls. I know I should make the calls.
And they want to start avoiding you.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's almost, not to make too much of this, but it's almost a spiritual thing of, I don't want to pick up the phone and call the coaches. The coaches don't want to pick up the phone and call the leader. The leader doesn't want to pick up the phone. And it's like, if we can push past that, then maybe it's an opportunity to train. Maybe it's an opportunity to encourage. Maybe it's an opportunity to say, you know what? I think this is just a bad fit. I think you should stop coaching. And then you're going to be less frustrated and they're going to be relieved. But again, going back to the trial run, and let's see if they have the stuff. Let's see if they're wired to, help other leaders that way.
I really love, and I want to highlight what you just said there about talking about modeling, really. So if as pastors and directors, we get lazy or neglectful or avoidant about having the hard conversations on accountability with our coaches, then we shouldn't be surprised if they then have a hard time picking up the phone and doing that with their leaders. And then they shouldn't be surprised that the leaders are not doing that with their members. So there's definitely a cascading effect. And it really starts with us kind of making that spiritual move. And I totally think it is a spiritual thing because it is about shepherding. And if we believe that this is important, then why wouldn't we do it? And stop checking Facebook, as you said.
Well, and the wolf is going to come after the one sheep that's kind of gone off and isolated itself.
Yes.
And that's really the job as the coach, is to go to, find that sheep, bring them back in, encourage them, help them, whatever, if they're going through something personally, if they're going through something in their group. And I think, we should delay everything else and make sure that we're making these connections that we need to make. Some people will say, well, why don't I just call the leaders directly myself instead of doing this phone, tag thing? And the reality is you could do that with maybe about 30 leaders. I tried for a while. I couldn't do it very well with 30 leaders, but you're going to hit a limit.
Yes.
And then the only reassurance that you're going to have is convincing yourself that everything's okay and putting your head in the sand because you're not finding out. So I don't think that's an easier way at all.
No, and eventually, that will implode. Okay, so number 4 is coaching all the leaders the same way. Talk to us about that. Yeah,
so if we try to say, okay, we're going to do this coaching. So we're going to get all the leaders together. And some of them started last week and some of them have been, leading a group for 30 years. I mean, there are those that are out there. And so we don't want to lose the new ones. So we're going to cater to the least common denominator.
Yes.
And that's going to be the beginner.
Yes.
And then the mature leaders are going to show up for training. They, first of all, they had to, make arrangements to be there.
Sure.
The training is too basic. Maybe they're doing it out of loyalty. But the bottom line is also it just feeds into the normal human thing that people hate meetings. I don't know if you. That was a very liberating thing for me. I was in seminary. I was trained that my purpose in life was to have meetings and train people. And then I would have these meetings, and it'd be there at the right time to start, and nobody was there yet. And I'd stand there in the room and listen to the crickets and question the call of God in my life until I realized that people hate meetings.
So dark.
And so then I decided I'd do 2 meetings a year. That's all I would do. But I think that, we have to consider, depending on the leader's experience, it's 2 things. It's the frequency of how many contacts we make. Mm-hmm. So if they're a new leader, then you're going to keep tabs on them, more often. If they're a mature leader, then we're going to check in with them once in a while, but we don't have to keep tabs on them weekly because that's a little heavy-handed. The other thing is going to be the nature of the contacts. Mm-hmm. That when you're at the beginning of the thing, they're going to need more instruction. They're going to need more guidance. They're going to need more help. They probably need more direction. But then as they gain experience and stand on their own 2 feet as a leader, they're going to need support. They're probably going to need more of us asking them questions than giving them answers. Because the other problem we get into is we have all these big, ministry-wide meetings, and what we discover is that we're answering questions that people aren't even asking.
Right.
And then the big key there is we just got to ask them what they need, and go from there.
Right.
So it's kind of like raising kids. I've got preschool, elementary, middle school, and high school.
Wow.
So I always want to know where my little boy is, because if he wanders off and I don't know where he is, and then, my daughter is going to be in her room, my son, my 12-year-old is going to be on his video games. My oldest, if I don't know exactly where he is, he's a teenager. Is that a problem? I just maybe you get lost. Maybe he's not coming back. I don't know.
Okay, maybe I should have this conversation with Tiffany, your wife.
Maybe so. Maybe a little counsel. I need a coach.
But yeah, no, to your point, I think coaching leaders differently. We started doing this in our huddles with separating them out by how long they've been leading, because that was targeted more towards the kind of questions they'd be asking, the stage of development for their group, and then also with our coaching system to actually have it set out so that you know exactly how many contexts you have for certain types of leaders. We kind of go through that to systemize some of it. And at the same time, though, like parenting, you parent each kid differently because they're wired differently. We try to encourage that. So the last one is so critical, and now we're out of time, but we're going to keep going. Just to finish this up, number 5 is neglecting your own leadership development is one of the top 5 coaching mistakes.
Yeah, and so this one actually came as kind of a hard experience. I went through a time when I was working with another ministry where we were coaching some very large churches across the country. And what we found is as all of these churches began to have success in recruiting new leaders and forming new groups, that in about half the cases, the small group pastor was replaced somewhere along the line because they were adequate for the role when they didn't have a lot of groups. But then once the ministry began to grow, they became, it's a tough word, but they came in a way disqualified from the ministry that they were leading because they didn't have the leadership capacity to do that. Now, those are extreme cases because it was kind of like this outside force came in and, was dictating all of these things and it kind of got out of their control. The reality is that most of us have the small group ministry that we're capable of leading. Even though we blame the senior pastor if he doesn't talk about it more, we blame this person and that person, we blame the weather. But the reality is, because for me, when we went from 30% in groups to having 125% in groups, the biggest change that happened in our ministry was between my 2 ears. It was a change in my thinking that had to take place. So you have to. So I don't want to go with the negative, but you have to develop yourself. John Maxwell talks about the law of the lid.
Yes.
And so your leadership ability puts a lid on where your ministry is capable of going. And that's not a criticism. It's just that, and I've studied Maxwell for a dozen or more years, along with some other folks, and you can increase your leadership ability. And by increasing your leadership ability, you're keeping ahead of where you need to go. In fact, I think it's a neat exercise to imagine, what if your church was twice as big as it is now? What if you had twice as many groups as you do now? What if you had 4 times as many? I was coaching a pastor up in Washington State, and they had 1,500 on the weekend, and we were preparing for what happens when this is a church of 6,000. What will that small group ministry look like? And what do you need to learn? And who do you need to develop? Because hopefully it's going to grow. And when it grows, you want to be prepared to have that kind of growth. The other thing, too, and this was a big learning for me, was giving other people opportunities for leadership.
Yes.
And so, again, releasing some of that control, because even if you had double the number of groups that you have now, you shouldn't have more work than you currently have.
Well, we only still have the same number of hours we have.
That's right. That's right. So you have to involve more people. You have to develop, instead of developing leaders, maybe you're developing coaches.
Right.
If you're at a church over 1,000, instead of developing coaches, you're investing in a leadership team that's going to supervise the coaches. And so it really is a matter of investing in others, working yourself out of the job of training and supporting leaders so that you can work yourself into the job of training and supporting coaches, and then eventually training and supporting, leaders of leaders of leaders. And not everybody has the luxury of hiring staff. The church I served here in Greenville, 6,500 on the weekend. I had one full-time assistant, and that was all of my staff.
Wow.
Everyone else was volunteer. Now, my predecessor had a good deal of that already set up. But then I began to build on that, but I couldn't go down to the leader level. Not that I was aloof. I would talk to my leaders if they stopped me to answer a question. Now, if they stopped me to ask me questions all the time, then I would say, what did your coach have to say about that?
Yes.
Well, I haven't talked to my coach. Well, why don't me and your coach get together and let's talk about this.
Right.
And, so that was kind of a training for everybody as far as that goes. But again, we can't plan on, we're going to have these budgets and, we're going to have, these people that are going to come on and, work for nothing and, that sort of thing. We're probably not going to have that. But we're actually better off not having that because, like I said before, we can recruit volunteers who are better people. And sometimes we think, okay, well, how do I know who to recruit? We go after all the usual suspects, and we, you don't want to steal people away from other people's ministry. But, here's a great little rule of thumb. Pray and ask God for the leaders that you need, and then pay attention to who crosses your path.
Right.
And we shouldn't be surprised that God actually answers our prayers. And yet I've fussed and fumed and been up half the night for weeks on end. Who am I going to get to lead this thing? I need to have somebody in this position. And then I would stop and say, okay, God, I can't do this. I need your help. And then the next day somebody would call me and say, God's really put it on my heart to maybe get more involved with small group ministry.
That's like the best.
And so what I started doing? Instead of all the fussing and fuming, I was like, I'm not going to stay up driving myself crazy for half the night. I'm going to pray. Mm-hmm. And then I say, okay, God, here's the deal. I'm human. You're God. I need to sleep. You don't. So I'm going to leave this in your hands. And when I wake up in the morning, I'll check in and see what you were able to accomplish overnight.
You're holding God accountable. Nice. No, but I'm laughing because I've so been there as well. And I think it's a really good word. Coaching is so critical because it makes our ministry scalable. And if we want to see growth and more people impacted, more people in community, you really can't avoid some version of coaching and investing in that next layer and then beyond, depending on the size. So thank you so much for your words of wisdom. And Alan's a friend of the Small Group Network, and he's active on our Facebook page. So if you want to ask him questions or interact with him or push back or share a joke, I don't know, whatever you'd like to engage with Alan, you can do that on our Facebook page. He also has a website, alanwhite.org, and his book, Exponential Groups. I think there's a link on your website and your blog, but it's also exponentialgroupsbook.com. And that has 2 chapters on coaching. So it's much more detailed than what we were able to get into during our time. Alan also has a consulting business or coaching business with a course. And you were just telling me that you're all full up now. You're taking a waiting list. So if people want to be on the waiting list, they can contact you via a website.
Yeah, we have a course that we just closed a week or so ago called Coaching Exponential Groups that touches on some of the things we talked about today and a bunch of other stuff that I didn't cover in the book. But yeah, just send me an email. We'll be opening it up again later this year. I'm not sure exactly when, but I'll let you know.
Yes. So you can go to his website for that. And I'm on his distribution list. So I get, it seems almost weekly or every couple of weeks. Alan's a terrific writer and he's got great practical content, which I appreciate. And so those just come through my email and I get to go, and a lot of them actually have been around coaching, which is what prompted me calling him up and saying, hey, can we talk about this? Because you keep writing about this. And I know that's such a core area for us. So thank you, Alan, so much. God bless you and your ministry.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
And thank you for listening to Group Talk. If you like what you hear, please leave us a positive rating on iTunes, which helps other ministry leaders find us. And if you want to give me any feedback, feel free to do that via our Facebook or Twitter, or any of our small group network social media. So we will see you next time. God bless.
Thank you for listening to Here to There, part of the Group Talk network of podcasts. If you like what you've heard, make sure you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you want to learn more, make sure you check out smallgroupnetwork.com for more resources.